I'm Chance Storland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you can find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic you'll hear discussed on the podcast. You may have seen or heard about the electric scooters that are now available for use in San Antonio. And in fact, this week on our sister podcast, Puro Politics, San Antonio Express News senior reporter Josh Baugh and a few other guests had a quick discussion of their experiences so far with the first scooter rental system that came to San Antonio last month, noting some of the advantages as well as drawbacks that they had seen and experienced. So to discuss these scooters in general, because as we'll get to, it's not going to be just one system in San Antonio. I'm joined now by Josh Baugh to get some of these anecdotes that were shared during Puro Politics, as well as the research that he is now conducting into how this is going to fit into city policy. So Josh, great to have you back here on the program for now the second time. Let's start with just some of the basics. This first company that began operating recently in San Antonio, when did it come to the city, and how do local residents or even visitors to the city use them to get around the area?
So a couple of weeks ago, kind of out of the blue, a company called Bird that's based out in California dropped about 150 scooters in the downtown area and a couple of the kind of outlying neighborhoods just outside of downtown. And, it kind of took the city by storm in a way because there was no kind of buildup, no anticipation that this was going to happen. All of a sudden, people just started seeing these scooters on the streets, which I think was an interesting kind of deployment tactic because I think it caused some buzz and, lots of kind of curious people wandering around saying, what are these things? What's the deal? And I had kind of seen them out and about and maybe seen a little bit of social media about it. And then I was coming out of a downtown restaurant with some colleagues at lunchtime a couple of weeks ago and decided it was too hot for me to walk all the way back to the newspaper. And I was curious. I'm an early adopter on a lot of tech kind of stuff. And so I downloaded the app and, put in all my information. And then away I was riding on this Bird scooter. Right before I decided I was going to do this, I noticed there's some tourists who are walking around downtown and they didn't ride the scooter, but they were really interested, intrigued by it. A couple ladies stopped and posed for selfies next to the scooter. So it's been a couple of weeks now. Last time I talked to city officials, there hasn't been any sort of major accident or issues between scooters and vehicles or pedestrians. At least based out of this first company that's launched here.
And so let's talk a little bit more about the city in a moment, but I want to talk about your experience with the device or just anyone else that you've spoken to about it. It was kind of funny during Puro Politics, if I remember correctly, the other hosts and you were talking about how they kind of went forward and then you spent time getting the scooter ready and then you came buzzing past them on the sidewalk. And they noted that, you're not supposed to be on the sidewalk. So it's kind of a funny story, but also I think the highest speed is like 15 miles per hour, but everyone in the discussion, they kind of noted that it seemed a lot faster than that. So as a user, what was that like?
I mean, quite honestly, it was a lot of fun. I as a kid, I rode bikes a lot, I rode skateboards. And when you're younger, going faster is always the ultimate goal. And when you're doing something that's self-propelled, especially if you're on a skateboard or a scooter, on flat ground, you kind of max out at a speed as fast as you can kind of kick. And, when I hopped on this scooter, you give it 3 good kicks and then hit the throttle and it's really zippy. It felt like it was going faster than 15 miles an hour. And I actually want to, run a test. One of these days, I'm going to get my colleague, Jasper, who, rode one shortly after I did, to actually get on the street while I'm in my truck. And I want to do a little anecdotal speed test on it to see if it actually only goes 15 or if it's going faster than that. The deck is fairly small. So I've got a very normal size foot and I don't think you can stack both of your feet together fully on the deck of the scooter. And so, you kind of get on the balls of your feet and your heels hang off a little bit. They look very much like those little razor scooters that kids ride around or used to ride around a lot. Slightly bigger because they've got a battery pack and a motor on them. But they're really kind of austere pieces of equipment. I mean, it's a handlebar. It's got a bell on the left side. It's got the throttle on the right side, a vertical pole that attaches to the deck, 2 rubber tires, and a little bit of electronics underneath the deck. And that's about it. So there's no shock absorption. And so one of the people I talked to recently said that riding on the cobblestone brick kind of streets in downtown is a little rough, but it's still, I think, a bit of a thrill to be moving like that on a device like that.
And so you notice that the device, doesn't really allow you to kind of have both your feet in tandem. You mentioned how kind of thin that part of the structure was. And I also didn't hear you mention a helmet. So was safety a concern when you were using this device at all?
So when you download the Bird app, you have to go through a series of disclosures, and you're clicking that you acknowledge that you're going to follow, local public safety laws. You're going to wear a helmet. You're going to share the road. Whatever their kind of disclosures are. The few people who I've talked to say, and myself included, when you're downloading that app, especially if you're standing there at the scooter for the first time, like you're just clicking yes, yes, yes as quickly as possible because you want to get to the part where you unlock the scooter and you start going. So, there are safety policies that are within the app that tell riders exactly how to use the scooters, both mechanically and also within their environment. But in practice, that's probably something that gets glanced over. At some point in the near future, I think the city's going to pass some regulations dictating how scooters are used in San Antonio. And my guess is there's going to be a lot of discussion about that public safety element. I don't think that it's possible. I could be wrong, but I don't think it's possible that there's any way to absolutely require that you use, say, a helmet. I think that's a state law, perhaps for motorcycles. I don't think that there's any kind of law that requires you to wear them for bicycles. Even though it's probably a best practice, and in the reality of using these scooters downtown, my guess is that you're not going to see a ton of people who carry bike helmets with them, and hop on a scooter and strap on. I'm sure some people will, and if you have people who are using them habitually to get to and from work, say from their neighborhood in King William or Southtown or Tobin Hill, you may see them using helmets. But for people who are around downtown, tourists or people who maybe work down there and need to travel a few blocks, I doubt that you're going to see that. And what we may see is some policies that require use of scooters in the streets as opposed to on the sidewalks. And I think that's probably more enforceable. I don't know that the city's going to want to start sending bike patrol officers chasing down people on scooters and writing citations, but it's possible. We'll have to wait and see what the city recommends to the Public Safety Committee of the City Council and what ultimately goes to the full City Council for a vote. But there are no policies at this point that dictate, whether in local or state law, that dictate how you use electric scooters. So it's a wide open arena for the city to do what it feels best in protecting both the safety of the riders and also pedestrians and motorists.
And so, of course, speaking of policy, let's kind of get to the other side of this discussion that I briefly mentioned at the top. You're doing a lot of research into how this is going to work for San Antonio. And also we can finally get to the other kind of elephant in the room is that you can now tell me about how, aside from this Bird company that kind of was the first to arrive just recently within the past few weeks, as you've already mentioned, there's going to be more companies coming to San Antonio. And then the city is going to have to try to figure out not only how do they deal with one, but now I think up to 3 different companies are going to have some sort of a rented electronic scooter for residents and people visiting San Antonio.
Yeah, so Bird was the first to launch. The city had already been in months of conversations with another company called Blue Duck, which is actually based in San Antonio, which is really fascinating because I think every other scooter, e-scooter rent by the minute company, I think they're all based in San Francisco and maybe Los Angeles. And so to have one that's local is, I think, really interesting. So I think these companies from the West Coast have been just hugely popular in terms of investors, and they've got billions of dollars in startup cash. Whereas Blue Duck is I'm told is kind of bootstrapping. It's kind of an offshoot of a local energy investment firm, and they've got a slightly different take on how they're handling their business practices. We're probably going to see a little bit more deployment from them along college campuses, but I think they're in urban centers like the Pearl. But I think that we're still going to see a lot of those scooters hitting the streets soon. And then there's a company called Lime, Lime, that's has a local lobbyist who reached out to me and let me know that they're going to be deploying here pretty soon. So I think from the policy side, the city's got a lot of discussion that they still need to have and figure out what San Antonio's best practices will be. They're looking at other cities and how other cities have regulated scooters leading up to this point. We may see that they're going to require a permit per company, or it may be that they're going to permit every scooter. It may be that they have some sort of a formula that allows for a certain number of scooters to be deployed here at the beginning, and then that may expand as they can prove that there's a demand for them. It's really, in the conversations I've had so far, it's really kind of wide open in how they're going to proceed. The city staff that's working on this is planning on making some recommendations to the Public Safety Committee, which is a handful of city council members that will vet these policies later in the summer, in August, when they come back from their summer break. And then what I'm told is in very short order that committee will make a vote on those proposals and may have some suggestions of their own, and then we'll forward that to the full city council so that there's a vote perhaps in August or September to set some policies as these scooters start to get deployed. The city has been very clear that there are no laws. They have no laws they can enforce, and so they've been trying to make contact with these companies and ask them to work with the city in good faith. But ultimately, there's nothing that the city can do because these companies don't have policies to violate. And so, there's a few instances where people left scooters, perhaps in the middle of a sidewalk, in the street, at a curb cut where you have ADA access for wheelchairs. And as that happens, there have been people from the downtown operations department at the city who've been taking the scooters to a central location and then allowing the company to come retrieve them. But there's not kind of any kind of fine or anything like that's been taking place. So it sounds kind of vague because it is a little vague at this point. The policies really range the gamut from different cities in the country. And so the city's, collecting all of those practices and will make those recommendations, but they're really kind of working through all of the different scenarios right now. And we'll have a whole lot more detail as we conclude the summer.
And I know this comparison is a bit, apples and oranges, but it's kind of fun to think about how this is very different to what happened with rideshare, at least originally in San Antonio. Obviously those two companies, the big ones being Uber and Lyft. Could you talk about those differences?
Yeah, there's a significant difference here, and I think it's being driven by a couple of different things. So about 5 years ago in 2013, Uber and Lyft came to San Antonio, and they deployed when there was no policy, and there was a lot of pushback and a big scramble to get some policies in place. And ultimately, the city council approved a policy, I believe, in 2014 that ended up driving Uber and Lyft out of San Antonio completely. They just folded operations here and said that the policies that the city had implemented were too onerous for them to be able to do business. And then, there's a lot of demand from residents, from voters here. They wanted rideshare to come back to San Antonio, and a couple of council members leaned pretty hard on it. And ultimately, the council passed a revised kind of compromise ordinance that allowed Uber and Lyft to come back to town and operate here. In looking at the scooter industry coming to town, there's not nearly the same kind of aggressive regulations that are coming forward. Everybody I've talked to from the city, whether it be city staffers or elected officials, all want to see this technology thrive in San Antonio. There's no desire to run them out of town, even for a temporary basis. They want these companies to operate here. They just need to figure out. They say they need to figure out a good soft set of regulations that keeps everybody safe. Now, the big difference between rideshare and the scooter technology is that with rideshare, there's a very robust, very vocal opposition in the form of taxi drivers. The taxi industry is very well funded. They fund through lobbyists. They make a lot of campaign contributions. They've been a powerful force in San Antonio and in everywhere they operate. And so they leaned very heavily on the city, and they complained about unfair advantages that were given to rideshare. And there's insurance and fingerprinting and all this different stuff played into their opposition, because ultimately they saw rideshare as being their chief competitor. And we have seen in the ensuing years that the taxi business has receded some here. I think to the tune of 50%. Rideshare has taken a lot of the business that taxis used to have. In the case of the scooters, there's really no comparable opposition or counterpart. The closest thing to those scooters would be the bike share program in town, and there's a lot of differences there. Bike share, the way that you rent them is very different. You have to pay per day, or you buy a year-long pass, and they have docks spread out through the city where you have a destination. You ride the bike, and you go out and ride around, and then you end up ultimately you have to return it to a specific dock. You have to get to a dock location, and you have to insert the bike there, and so there has to be capacity at that particular dock, or you have to go find another dock where there is capacity. With the scooters, and bicycles, obviously they're human power, so you got to pedal. That output, especially in the summertime, is perhaps okay for tourists, but less awesome for people who are wearing work clothes, for example. Whereas the scooter program is 100% dockless, which means that it's all GPS enabled. You use a smartphone app to unlock them. Wherever you come across them, you scan a QR code and you're off and running. And then when you get to your destination, you simply park the scooter wherever you are, against a wall or near a bike rack. You shoot a picture of it and you lock it through the app, and then you're done. You don't have to go find a dock. It's a lot more kind of user friendly, especially for if you're zipping around and you need to get from one side of downtown to the other. I interviewed one person who oftentimes will ride a bus from the north side of San Antonio down the highway and then to a destination in downtown, and he'll go to work. And at lunchtime, he's either relegated to what's within a block or two walking distance for him, or he has to take an Uber and Lyft to go if he wants to go farther. And he said to me that with the scooter program, he can walk out, grab a scooter, and he can really go all the way across downtown. So his range has expanded significantly without having to call rideshare. And that's, even if you're just going a short distance with rideshare, that's it can be a lot more expensive than a scooter. The scooters run $1 to unlock and 15 cents a minute, whereas a base ride on Lyft to go. I take Lyft sometimes from the newspaper to City Hall, and that's a $5 to $8 ride, which would probably cost me, I don't know, $250 on a scooter. So there's a lot of difference there.
And as you mentioned, if you take the scooter, there might be a little bit more kick in your step when you get to City Hall. I mean, it's a very different experience than using a Lyft. So let's wrap up now, Josh. I guess I just want to ask you final thoughts based on everything that we've discussed or anything that we haven't really talked about yet. Is this a net win for San Antonio? It doesn't really sound to me like there's any real problem that could occur other than just safety.
That remains to be seen. I think that San Antonio is more accepting of in cities that are not on the coast, that are not in tech hubs, are more accepting of this new technology. I think on the Puro Politics podcast, we talked a little bit about a Vice News story out of San Francisco, and apparently people in San Francisco are completely revolting against the e-scooter programs. They're vandalizing the scooters. There's a picture of one in the river. Several of them have been tossed into trees. People have been scratching off the QR codes so you can't unlock them, physically cutting cables on them so they won't operate. And so in that case, there's a ton of them dropped in the city all of a sudden, and they can be cumbersome, and they can be kind of a hassle, I guess, if there's too many of them. One of the things that city officials have pointed to in my reporting is the city of Dallas had a bike program that's a dockless bike program, and a company or a number of companies came into town and dropped something like 20,000 bicycles in the city all at once. And those are a little bit different. They don't require overnight charging, but people have described literal piles of bicycles, on sidewalks or in a yard or whatever. And so I think that's the big concern from the city, is to make sure that the companies themselves police their own equipment, that they make sure that the stuff is maintained, that they're not being left. ADA accessibility is a major issue. We have a lot of people in wheelchairs, mechanical wheelchairs, and they want to make sure that these things don't block pathways, whether it's curb cuts or sidewalks, and that there's not too many of them in town where they're just kind of littering the environment. But I think that in San Antonio, we've got a lot of geography here. It's a lot different than a really high density urban city in a lot of other places. So they're probably going to be a little bit more spread out. And I don't know that these companies are going to drop so many that there are too many for people to use.
Yeah, no, very good points to bring up. So I'm glad I got your perspective there as our final thought for the discussion. Some of those things, they're not so native. You might not realize those will be problems. But yeah, and I do remember during this week's episode of Puro Politics that you can download for free at expressnews.com/podcasts. Those were things that you did mention specifically, as well as a few others that we did not mention during this conversation that are little tidbits that you can find in this week's episode of Puro Politics. So that's where we're going to leave it, Josh. Thank you for joining me once again, now 2 times here on the In-Depth podcast. And in the near future, you'll find some of the information that we discussed today in a write-up by Josh Baugh in the San Antonio Express News. So, Josh, look forward to having you here on the podcast again sometime in the near future. And thanks for the discussion today.
Thanks for having me.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News senior reporter Josh Baugh for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth podcast, an interview program brought to you by expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.